Hi, I'm Adam Shepherd.
And I'm Jane McCallion.
And you're listening to the ITPro Podcast.
When the world switched to remote working last year, many employees found themselves using their personal laptops to do their jobs. But as organisations struggled to adapt to the new situation, the question of how to keep these devices secure has become a thorny one. Without the layers of protection that typically safeguard corporate equipment, their personal devices could present a potential risk.
To combat this, some IT departments have turned to installing monitoring software on their staff's personal computers. But is this really in employees' best interests, or does it cross the line between safety and surveillance? Here to discuss this issue is Kevin Curran, Professor of Cybersecurity at Ulster University. Kevin, thanks for coming on the show.
You're welcome. Glad to be here, guys.
So I must say, firstly, it is nice to have you on the podcast. You are quite a regular commentator on the site, for features and for news to an extent as well. So, yeah, lovely to be able to speak to you in person.
Same here.
So let's talk first of all about why an organisation might want to monitor a worker's device activity. What is the benefit of that to them?
The immediate benefit, the obvious benefit, is that you're able to see what your employees are doing. In other words, you're able to track their progress, and because an employer is paying the salary of an employee. Now, that doesn't mean that, of course, where's the boundary between what you can ask an employee to do, and where does your power overreach? And of course, we have employment laws that help us with that. But in the mainstream, really, what you're trying to see is, are your employees the ones that you're paying? Are they behaving according to policies you might have, within your IT department or just within your employment itself? Are they doing the job that you're paying them for? Are they interacting with customers, for instance, if it was a remote call center, whatever else? Of course, in some ways you can see if employees are delivering because employees have targets. So, for instance, we've known that salespeople are on the road for many years. Now maybe they do more phone calls and more virtual, but for the last 40, 50 years, we're familiar with the traveling salesperson who doesn't work in the office, but yet how he's monitored really is just by his sales targets and he has to achieve. And if he wants to lax, or she wants to lax off and spend a day watching, Netflix, well, then they just won't have any sales. And even if they do want to spend a day watching Netflix, but they're brilliant at, at sales, and they bring in the targets, well, then the employer doesn't care because they met the targets. But it's not always that easy for people to have targets, really. Yeah, it's not that simple. So therefore, one of the ways around that is just simply surveil everything the employees are doing to see if they are working, if they're answering calls, and whatever else that is.
Beyond the productivity perspective, though, does this have any bearing on security? So one of the kind of areas where monitoring software and monitoring technology has been brought up is in kind of monitoring workers' activity, essentially to track and identify potentially any suspicious behavior or any activity that may introduce threats to the corporate network.
Yeah, absolutely. That's apart from the obvious privacy point, with privacy and security go hand in hand, really. The people leading the privacy movements in the world to protect citizens are people who have good backgrounds in security, who understand the implications and things that can happen. But in this case, you have security because really, when it comes to when it comes to remote monitoring of employees, you're really monitoring their browsing history. You're monitoring their emails, you're monitoring any activity they do, remote access control, screen activity, and even time record, how long they're active on their site or whatever, your portal is, whatever else. So in that respect, yeah, you could possibly see that employees are visiting, first of all, dodgy sites, which is one way to get spyware on your own computer. And again, we can presume in most of the cases that the computer they're using is generally nowadays a laptop or an iPad, and it's given to them by their employer. So the employer has the right to do that. Most people have employer-owned devices. But again, so there is that side of it. But even with remote monitoring without it, because at the end of the day, unless you got plenty of time and do roll back and look back at all the activity of the person, you might not spot any employees going to particular websites and doing stuff. But there is a certain percentage of malware things that it will stop, but it really is it's more the privacy side. Okay, again, you could argue, should an employee be able to use an employer-owned device after 5 o'clock when they finished? And then forget, obviously, the worry is they forget that the employer has got spy software on the computer and they go to something that they don't want, or it could be perfectly legitimate. They might log into their GP practice and order a pack of Viagra or something, which is fine, but you don't want your employer to know that necessarily. So that's the thing. So that's the thing but we need, probably, again, we need to educate people as much as anything.
Yeah, because I was going to ask, is there an obvious line, or is it a bit blurry where you move from oversight into snooping?
Yeah.
And how can employers balance that?
Yeah, of course, because we also haven't said some employers will have a video camera on again, and there's nothing more intrusive in modern life than a video camera or a webcam in a room, again, which can be turned on anytime or left on. We've seen many examples of it over the last year, but with
I can't stop thinking about that Canadian politician.
There was another one, another one last week. Yeah, the politician who was naked and forgot the.
Yeah, he was. He got changed from his jogging outfit into his suit in front of a webcam.
I totally feel for him, because it's been a crazy year, and we try to, we have back-to-back Zoom meetings and everything else, and you try to grab something in between. And that's why I recommend anyone to get the webcam slides. They're only about £1 on eBay or on Amazon, £2, and you get a pack of 6, and you put them over any of your devices, and it's a little slider, and it fits lovely on your phone, on your iPads, because I've been doing it for many years. In fact, I was one of the first in the UK to say I put tape over my webcam. That was about 8-9 years ago, and I got a lot of abuse for that. I got people emailing me saying I was weird and everything else, because now we all know that. And I've always said I don't see it as I don't put the tape over. Actually, after a year or two, I didn't put the tape over it anymore because of security, because I knew the odds on me being targeted with the webcam on and me not seeing it were minuscule. But just from the point of view, and I recommend anyone, because you can forget your webcam, your camera is on, because you can be using Zoom all year, for instance, and when you join a meeting, the camera is off. Again, it could be up, and then someday you might get a Cisco web call, and it's the opposite. The camera is on by default, and you're just presuming it's off, and you don't even check, because you've been doing it for 6 months on Zoom and all the other, on Google Meet and everything else, and you forget that one time, and you're just coming out of the shower, and you're not trying to, to flash the world, but flip, it can happen to anyone. So I would say that to anyone, just for the accidents point of view, is to keep them little sliders and buy them and put them over your webcam if you don't already have an automatic one. But generally, the rule of thumb is that the monitoring must be lawful, fair, and transparent. And it must be specified beforehand, so that the employees know what's being monitored, what's being collected. So it's a bit like the GDPR to some degree, but really the key is that the employees must know what devices are listening. Is it a microphone? Is it a video camera? Is it just your browsing history? Is your email? And, and what time and what can you do on the device? And as long as you know that, and as long as they know that, and it's being explained to them, well, then that's the key thing. If they do something afterwards which puts them in a compromising situation, as long as it was fairly explained beforehand, well, then, we could all accept that.
So that's perhaps quite understandable for employer-owned devices, but something we've seen a lot of over the past year is when everyone kind of had to switch very rapidly to remote working, there was a huge crunch on home working hardware, including laptops and whatnot, and many organizations had to resort to essentially having employees using their own personal laptops or PCs or whatever they had around, essentially, to work from home, just because there was no alternative. You couldn't get a laptop in kind of March, April last year for love nor money. So if that's the case, if employees are still working off their own personal devices, how does that impact the whole monitoring situation? Can an employer ask or indeed demand to install monitoring software on an employee's owned personal device?
And it is, by the way, it's legal in the UK to monitor employees' personal devices, and it's legal to monitor employees' personal computers, but only if that device holds work-related information, or the
Mm,
employer wants to restrict use during working hours, guarantee quality control or ensure that employees comply with company rules. But again, all businesses should have a clear BYOD, bring your own device policy,
Hmm.
and we do that. I mean, to some degree, it's just been automatic. For instance, for many years in my university, which I should have as best, but I have to have a PIN code, obviously, or a Face ID and log in on, and we all have to on our devices because
mm,
to connect to Exchange, it makes it safer, of course, it means. But and of course, they can wipe my device, even though it's my iPhone. But if it does get lost, I'm obliged to inform the IT department, and they should remotely lock down, wipe my device actually, and
mm.
that's par for the course, and that's important in these day and age, and it protects customer privacy as well. And I would have the same rules. I would create the same rules, because it's important to protect any customer data, or in my case, student data, or any legal cases I'm working on, whatever else. But of course, maybe employers in them cases will subsidize or give a payment to employees, or whatever else, or maybe they just at least they have a job, that so.
There's a lot to be said for that in this day and age.
Mm,
No,
yeah.
Mm.
it's funny because actually I was under the impression that it was totally legal in the US to, install effectively whatever you liked on your employee's phone
It's,
or
it's spy. Well, I
whatever
mean, it's
device.
spyware.
Spyware.
It's
Yeah.
yeah.
Kind of if they're going to be using that device for work, but that it wasn't over here. I imagine that Europe is probably a bit tighter on this. Just Europe being Europe, that is the sense that I would get. You can't just mess around with people's devices, and you would have to, probably give them a device if you wanted to monitor them.
No, it's legal in the UK. If the employee has any work-related information on their device, is using it to do any work-related whatever task, even they might find their phone is faster, then it's perfectly legal for you, because in some ways it's your data systems, it's your customer data, and you have to protect that. But of course, you're right, and it has to be made obvious to the employee beforehand, and the rights. But again, I guess the employee could, of course, come along and say, "Look, I don't want anything on my personal device." So therefore, there in the case, it's up to the employer to obviously provide that employee with a device. And of course, what company doesn't give at least one phone or one tablet or one computer? I mean, they're so cheap nowadays. There's no company who would do that.
I think as the lines between work life and personal life kind of increasingly blur, I think this is becoming less and less of a cut and dried issue.
Yeah.
Because back in the day, you did have a work phone and a personal phone, and you could kind of largely separate them. But because everything is digital, everything is application based now, realistically, even if you do have a work phone and a personal phone, odds on you're going to have access to the same apps on both. So, you're going to be signed into your work email with your personal device, or you're going to be signed into your work kind of Dropbox account or whatever with your personal device, because, it's easier than not doing it, and it's massively more convenient. So, from a kind of data privacy and a data access point of view, is there any value in making that distinction anymore?
Yeah, and especially with the work from home aspect, because okay, we've known that wo- workplaces for many years now have introduced video monitoring. They've been monitoring calls, and even a lot of places their devices or computers. Of course, I've never experienced that myself. Yeah, it's an interesting one. If I was given a job that was X% better paid, but of course I would get around that. Of course I would dedicate a PC. What am I? What am I thinking? I've got 18 laptops and flipping. I would
One of my
just,
tribe.
yeah, I would just
One of
accept that.
us,
Yeah,
one of us.
yeah, increase. We just keep that for. But it's the fact is, okay. So we've known for years that there's video cameras on your work, and you're not going to slap your colleague in the face, and and your calls are monitored, and you're hardly going to start visiting, extreme porn sites in your office space. You're just not. So you would behave differently. But when you're at home, then the video comes into it. Then obviously the microphone comes into it. If you forget yourself and you start browsing to dark places, whatever else. So it just, there's new things people have to consider, and things we never thought would happen, probably for 10, 15, 20 years. But COVID has just accelerated so much of the technology world. The way geeks knew where it was going. We've known for many
Mm.
years that we've been shopping online, we've been doing everything online, we've been remote, but the public haven't been, and they've been shocked into seeing the world the way that we know it is. But COVID has really accelerated everything by so many years. And the thing about it, it has actually increased the amount of now that's anecdotally, but I've seen where it has increased the amount of remote monitoring of workers, because in the past, you'd have just like I said, you'd have supervisors. It was accepted that the majority of your employees were working at their computers and you didn't have to do whatever. But when they're at home, they're out of sight, out of mind. And if you're paranoid as a manager or a CEO, you're gonna just want to see what they're doing. And I can see that when your margins for profit in most businesses, are very, very small. And you're just trying to keep the roof over your head and everything else. Like, everything helps. And when people are kind of by nature inherently lazy, um, you know, we all want to get everything for free. It's just one of them rules that we just have to accept in modern life. But again, the more tech savvy you are, the better it is, or the more honest, even if you're an honest person, you have nothing to worry about, or in that case, or if you're just doing your job and everything else, and you don't
Mm.
forget yourself and do crazy things, then you have nothing to worry about. But the other things, it's in your favor if you're tech savvy, then to know what's reasonable and what's not. And some people have very kind of this they have illusionary thinking when it comes to security and privacy and these things, and they don't fully understand at all. They think everything can be hacked. They think that everyone's listening to them. I've seen that many times, because I'm a professor of cybersecurity. I've been emailed and approached by people. I'd met people in my canteen who had bizarre worries, which were just like something in a movie. And I've
Mm.
seen it. I've seen it once too many to know that these were not just outliers. That there's a small percentage of people really who really, really worry about being hacked and believe that they are hacked and are being hacked every day. And they're on the phone to Apple. They're on the phone to well, usually, or whoever else. Usually Apple. But
Mm.
People have been watching that documentary, Mr. Robot, and taking it too seriously. Now, I'm wondering, Kevin, you mentioned that devices are so cheap now. Realistically, if there isn't a supply chain problem, then companies can and will provide them for their employees. That's
yeah.
just the way that you do it. Has this experience maybe put paid to the idea then of BYOD? Because that was like such a thing when
Yeah.
I was, kind of
Yeah.
first starting. It's just, well, everyone's going to want their own devices, and millennials. And
Yeah.
then I found out I'm a millennial. Um, is that something do you think is happening, or is BYOD still the trend?
I mean, but it's like everything else. I mean, at the time it was a buzzword, like everything, and it just becomes accepted practice. And of course, there was a reluctance. We've all seen how large organizations, especially, reluctantly move into what is just best. In other words, so give you an example, like for instance, the cloud.
Mm.
Like still to this day, like law firms are reluctant and maybe healthcare providers to move into the cloud because it's like moving it off third party, onto a third party premise and everything else. But eventually everyone does it. My university, I'm sure every workplace, for many years, you were not supposed to use Dropbox or Google Drive, and it was all your files were supposed to be held on the local servers. And I can understand that, but it wasn't pragmatic because when Dropbox took off, and also Google, but Dropbox in particular, it was such a well written piece of software that synced in the perfect way, and we didn't have to use remote logins to our desktops at work if we forgot files, and it just made life simpler. And everyone was using it. And of course, everyone knew we were using it. But the official line was, you can't use any third party. until, and then of course that changed. And same with BYOD again. You weren't supposed to use in the early days any other device apart from the university one. But then eventually they realized, well, hang on, and because everything speeded up so well. If you remember mobile phones went literally from only 5% of the population having them to about 90% in 1 year. It was that quick when they first came out. So, technology accelerates at a huge pace, and BYOD is important because, again, employers have to be responsible for their customer data, and their customer data is handled by their employees. And if a leakage occurs, of course, they can be subject to large fines. They could go out of business. So they have to have the correct policies in place. And you can imagine, okay, depending on the organization, so you would have different BYOD policies, I guess, in Ulster University rather than maybe the Ministry of Defence, or you can imagine the National Cybersecurity. But still, generally 90% of the rules would be the same. It's just safe practice of
Mm.
don't go here, don't do that, don't click on that, blah blah blah. Education is always crucial.
Yeah.
There is one problem with the remote monitoring of employees as well, that the increased surveillance in it is like under GDPR, there's certain things which employers shouldn't be able to capture on this, like our physical or mental health, unless we offer it, our sex life or sexual orientation, or they know what our racial origin is when they look at us, but also trade union membership and everything else. Oh, there's things which employers cannot ask you for. But when you have now remote monitoring where things can be captured, or everything you do, again, they could inadvertently capture that. And that's a kind of a gray line there, because what if they do capture it? Can they record it? Can they hold it against you? Or is it just your bad luck that you went to a site where you typed in, that they found out your sexual orientation and whatever else? But I think, there is people who don't like that, and rightly so. We want privacy champions along the way. But we want people fighting their corners, but we also want our economy as well. We want employers to have a fair chance too, because um, they're the ones who put the hard sweat in the early days again. And sometimes it's too easy for us to see large corporates as being faceless, but at the end of the day, they're providing employment really,
Mm.
and that yeah.
Mm.
So, in terms of the practicality of this, then we've talked a lot about the legalities of it, and employees' rights versus employers' rights and obligations, but we haven't really discussed so much the effectiveness of these measures from a security perspective. How effective is kind of device-based activity monitoring in stopping, cyber threats?
Yeah, stopping cyber threats, God, it's hard to put a number on that, but it probably has some effect, because, like I said, employees, because a lot of the number one attack vector is still phishing emails, really.
Mm.
So at least with monitoring of emails as well, you're able to spot if there's one coming into all the employees, which is often the case. They bulk mail, every or every email address in an organization. And also maybe employees really ultimately will think more about where they visit, what they click on, if they know that the device is being monitored. So from that perspective, you could argue that it is, it helps in aids and security. But yeah, you're right. And productivity, I don't know how to do that, how to measure that. I haven't read papers on, do companies that, has anyone set up a gold, or I wonder, has anyone set up a blind study where they monitor half their employees, they don't monitor the other half, and then they compare the productivity at the end of, whatever time. And that's the only way you could prove whether monitoring works or not. And I'm sure there has. I
Mm.
mean, I'm sure I'm not the first person to think about that. But from security point of view, it's a little help. But still, you could argue that actually education would be better, to give your
Mm.
employees training on security repeatedly, send them on courses, or give them whatever they need for that, or just train them, have webinars regularly, and keep, that would probably be more effective. Maybe also just employ more IT security officers, you know,
One of the eternal answers to solving
yeah,
IT security: just throw more bodies at it.
yeah,
I think email, in particular, is one area where monitoring can and does work very well, and I think that's something that every employee pretty much kind of expect in terms of monitoring. They expect that their corporate email is going to be, monitored and tracked for security purposes, as well as, likely for, HR reasons and, business, various other business benefits. But another area where I think it can be quite successful is in picking up insider threats. One of the kind of slightly newer technologies that we've seen come up over the past couple of years is behavioral monitoring, where they can, identify on a kind of very broad, high level. This employee usually is active on, their like cloud accounts or on the internal VPN or whatever from 9 to 5, and they're usually dialing in from the UK, and that's fine. But this week we've noticed that between 7 and 2 in the morning, they're active a lot more than they usually are, and they're dialing in from Hong Kong or from Hyderabad or whatever, and that's unusual, and that's something that we're going to look into as a potential indicator of compromise.
Or indeed that they normally kind of don't bulk download loads of sensitive files, but today they did. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're right. There's a rise in a lot of companies offering and just machine intelligence being brought into the equation, looking for, anomalies in behavior. But again, it remains to be seen how effective it is. Because if you think about your network, if you fire up a network packet sniffer like Wireshark, which we use to monitor packets flying over network. I mean, even in your own network at home, you'll find that you probably have 30 or 40 devices from your washing machine to your TV, everything, your speakers, all sending packets out over your home network, to the wider internet. And it's really hard to identify what's what and what device is speaking and where's it, So therefore, when you expand that then to any, relatively large organization with, hundreds or thousands of employees, also, and also a file copy, whatever else. And I'm dubious of a lot of these things, but I'm not dubious about things like firewalls or things, which are more rules based, where you're able to see the latest malware coming in. You're able to spot a signature. Okay, this malware has been sent, it's been spotted, it's got a CVE, and all those things work perfectly because they're basically rules based. And of course, you have, I'm not saying all, like, even your virus scanners are heuristic. That they don't look. They know that modern malware, the great malware, is always morphing itself and modifying itself, and there is AI playing there for sure, and it's wonderful, along with rules based. But any organization, after a few weeks, it becomes just like any job. You don't feel, oh, I'm working for the NSA today, and I'm working for GCHQ. It just becomes a job, and you're working on important things. You got to be more, when you're out drinking or a trade show, for instance. You just got to be wiser about what you say, because you are dealing with state secrets to some degree. But after a while, you forget, and you're just trying to do your job. You're trying to move up the ladder. You're trying to be productive, and if you need a USB key and to copy a bunch of files and take it home and work on them because you're really looking for the next and you have no intention to give them to the Russians, you will just do that. And how the hell would any software spot that? Because like I said, every single file on older file systems should be sacrosanct. But of course, you got to get it from one device to the other, and people got to do their jobs. So people will always take shortcuts. And the insider threat, of course, is so hard to prevent against. It's impossible, actually, if you're honest about it.
There's mitigations, but yeah, I think at the end of the day, a really motivated insider is always going to be able to get around them. For me, it comes down to, like a lot of security, in fact, it comes down to that old joke of, I don't have to outrun the lion, I just have to outrun the other guy.
That's right. Or that the famous is that cartoon that does all the tech, where they say, look at it, we can run a brief where they've got a guy and they want to get into a system, and they say, oh, we can buy £500,000 of Amazon cloud service, and we can cloud crack this 256-bit whatever, and it'll take us 6 months. And the other guy turns, we can just hit him over the head with this hammer and ask him for the password. you know, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that is an
Well,
XKCD cartoon, which we will link in
that's
the
it.
show
That's
notes.
exactly it. But also the thing is, again, if someone came to me and said, "God, I need to get you know, I need to get into the account of someone who's famous," and they're
Mm,
giving me 2 million quid now. Someone who's a young computer graduate would probably sit there, you know, and taking cybersecurity and would think, okay, okay. And then they start logging on to sites like Zerodium or go to the dark web and trying to find, you know, and by the time you get to, you know, and just, you know, how do I get this here and there and spend a few 100,000, whatever, because you know you're getting 2 million. But,
mm,
but what a savvy security guy would do is you just befriend someone who works on Instagram and you pay them. And
Mm.
then they let you into the system. It's always the insider, and that's what governments are doing all the time. They also have people working in companies, foreign governments. They have people working in companies like Instagram and Facebook and everything else that are from overseas. And of course, the vast, vast, vast majority of these people are honest and tech people and blah, blah, blah. But
but it
all the
only takes
governments,
one.
Hmm.
it does. They have got insiders in all the big companies, you know. But yeah, spies.
Mm.
Mm.
So, Kevin, for companies that are considering implementing some kind of employee monitoring, what would be your advice?
My advice is to be explicit from startup. Know your employees. Maybe one size doesn't fit all. You know, just ask yourself on all the things you're monitoring. Like, do you need a video feed? Do you need to monitor emails or just a web browsing really? But and explain to employees and just make sure you're within legislation that you don't monitor, you don't grab anything that's not necessary for their job to be carried out really. And that would really be my advice. And you know, I'm not against it. I think we have to move on in life, you know, because in some ways, when you go to work, you'd be monitored, and you know, even before the rise of technology, you'd be monitored at work by someone looking at you.
Mm.
You know, but of course you're in your workplace then, and it's just that we all, and it is sacrosanct as well, and we have to, you know, keep an eye out anywhere where government or any legislation goes over over the line against privacy, because well, you know, we're all entitled to private lives. We're all entitled to, you know, especially within our castles. And some greedy employers could, you know, really try to extract every pound of flesh from their employees, really. But the majority won't. They'll just do you know, what maybe keeps them productive, keeps them in the market.
Well, unfortunately, that's all we've got time for this week, but thanks once again to Kevin Curran, Professor of Cybersecurity at Ulster University, for joining us.
Thank you.
You can find links to everything we've spoken about in this episode in the show notes, and even more on our website, www.itpro.co.uk.
Don't forget to follow us on social media and subscribe to the ITPro newsletter for more great content.
You can also subscribe to the ITPro Podcast wherever you listen to podcasts to never miss an episode. And until next week, I'm Jane McCallion.
And I'm Adam Shepherd.
Bye.
Bye. The ITPro Podcast is brought to you by the Dennis Podcast Network.